You can tell when something is wrong before anyone says it aloud. Something in the room shifts. The way people move, the conversations that trail off, the attention that clusters without announcement around the one person who needs it most. You have felt this. You have probably acted on it without knowing exactly why. Cynthia Moss noticed the same thing happening in a herd of elephants in Kenya's Amboseli Basin. She founded the Amboseli Elephant Research Project in 1972, and across more than 50 years of continuous observation, she has watched hundreds of elephants die. What has stayed with her is not what happens after death, but what happens before it, sometimes hours before and sometimes days, at a point when no human observer could have identified what was coming. The herd would begin to change, drawing closer around the one who was going under, touching more, vocalizing differently, orienting collectively toward an outcome none of them could have been told about. The matriarch, called EB, stayed beside her dying brother for 3 days. He was older. His teeth had worn to almost nothing. He walked with the slow, deliberate shuffle of an animal, carrying weight that had nothing to do with his body. When he finally went down for the last time on the dry lake bed, EB did not leave. She stayed through the heat of the afternoon, through the following night, through the next morning. That record leads to a question biology has spent decades trying to answer, and still has not resolved. Do animals know when another animal is dying? If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And, if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments. I read every one. The question sounds deceptively simple. It turns out to be one of the harder problems in animal cognition, partly because knowing means very different things depending on what you ask next. Knowing that another animal is about to die requires, at minimum, some mental representation of death as a future state, a projection forward in time, an awareness that the current condition of a living individual leads, on a specific trajectory, toward an endpoint. These are cognitive operations that took an immense stretch of evolutionary time to develop, and the evidence for whether any non-human animal uses them the way humans do is, at this point, genuinely contested among the researchers who study it most closely. What is far less contested is the behavioral record. Animals respond to dying members of their species in ways that are specific, consistent, and in many documented cases appear well before any obvious physical deterioration begins. The question is what it represents. In 2010, a research team, led by James Anderson at the University of Stirling, published a detailed account of what happened inside a chimpanzee community in a Scottish safari park during the final hours of a 50-year-old female named Pansy. Cameras had been running continuously in the enclosure, and what they captured became one of the most discussed pieces of footage in animal cognition research. The other chimpanzees gathered around Pansy as her condition worsened. They groomed her with unusual attention and for longer than was typical. They held her hands. They attempted, repeatedly, to rouse her when she became unresponsive, touching her face and rocking her body. After she died, the male who had been closest to her, a chimpanzee who had been her companion for years, sat beside her body for the rest of that day and into the evening, making no move to join the rest of the group. Her daughter, who had been grooming her in the final minutes before she died, slept beside the body that night rather than returning to the communal sleeping area. Pansy's grandson, who had never in his life witnessed a death, appeared to avoid the spot where she had died for several days afterward. None of this, on its own, proves that the chimpanzees understood she was going to die before she did. But Anderson documented a detail that drew particular attention from other researchers. The behavioral changes among the group began approximately 12 to 14 hours before Pansy died, at a point when to the human observers watching the footage, she appeared simply unwell. She was still mobile at that stage. She was still taking food. There was nothing, to human eyes, that marked the next 12 hours as categorically different from what might have been a temporary illness. And yet, at precisely that point, the grooming around her intensified. The vocalizations among the group changed in register, and the proximity of the other chimpanzees to her tightened. Something shifted in the group before any human in that facility could have told you the end was near. The first and most obvious explanation is chemical detection. Animals across almost every taxonomic class are extraordinarily sensitive to chemical signals that human sensory equipment simply cannot register, and dying bodies produce those signals in abundance. As cellular processes begin to fail, the metabolic byproducts they generate change in character and volume. Dimethyl trisulfide, a compound associated with tissue breakdown, accumulates in the air around a dying body. Volatile organic compounds shift in composition. The microbiome of a dying organism changes in ways that produce different airborne outputs than the microbiome of a healthy one. This is not metaphysical. It is chemistry that an animal with a sufficiently sensitive nose can read the way a human reads a page. A dog's nose contains roughly 300 million olfactory receptors. A human nose contains about 6 million. Which means that a dog occupying the same room as a seriously ill human is operating in a sensory world so different from the one we inhabit that any attempt at direct comparison becomes almost meaningless. Dr. Deborah Wells at Queen's University Belfast documented dogs responding to epileptic seizures before they occurred, and subsequent work built on that foundation to test whether dogs could reliably detect cancers, specific infections, and the physiological state associated with imminent death. The hospice literature has accumulated case reports for decades of dogs and cats showing behavioral changes around patients in the hours before death, changes that attending staff had learned, over time, to treat as meaningful clinical information rather than coincidence. At the Steer House Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Providence, Rhode Island, a cat named Oscar became the subject of a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007. The paper was written by Dr. David Dosa, a geriatric specialist who had initially been skeptical of what the nursing staff were reporting. Oscar had developed the habit, over the first year of his life in the facility's advanced dementia unit, of seeking out and sleeping beside specific patients. Staff noticed that his choices were not random. He would curl up beside patients who subsequently died, typically within 2 to 4 hours of taking up his position. Over a 7-year period, Dosa documented this pattern beside more than 100 patients. The staff eventually began notifying families when Oscar chose to stay with a particular resident, because his record for predicting death within that window had become more consistent than most standard clinical assessments of the same time frame. What Oscar was detecting, nobody knows with certainty. Dosa did not speculate beyond what the evidence could support. The possibilities include the scent of organ failure, changes in body temperature, differences in the sound of respiration as the body approaches shutdown, or some combination of these. What was not in question was the behavioral consistency across 7 years and more than 100 cases. The same pattern repeating without exception. Crows appear in the behavioral literature with surprising frequency, given how little attention they receive outside specialist circles. Dr. Kaylee Swift at the University of Washington spent years running controlled experiments in which she and her team presented wild crow populations with a taxidermied crow positioned near their foraging sites. The response was immediate and consistent across dozens of trials. The crows stopped foraging. They called loudly, and the calling drew other crows from distances of several hundred meters. They would mob the dead bird, diving at it repeatedly, sometimes for several minutes. They would then avoid the foraging site for weeks at a time. Swift's initial interpretation was behavioral and practical. A dead crow is a signal that something lethal happened at this location. The mobbing and calling are information-sharing behavior, warning the wider group that this area carries an unidentified threat. The avoidance is a rational response to that signal. This explanation holds up well and requires no grieving or death awareness on the part of the crows. What made it less clean was what happened in some trials when crows began bringing objects and placing them near the dead bird. Sticks, blades of grass, small pieces of bark. The behavior was not universal, and it was not present in every trial, but it occurred often enough across different individuals and different geographic populations that Swift documented it in her published work. She could identify no survival function that it served. She described the behavior, when pressed, as ritualistic. It was a word she chose carefully. It was also the only word that accurately described what she had filmed. The behavioral science working in this area has a vocabulary problem that every researcher in it acknowledges openly. The field has spent decades trying to describe what it observes without accidentally projecting human frameworks onto animals that may operate in entirely different cognitive registers. Grief implies a subjective emotional experience that cannot be confirmed from outside an organism. Mourning implies a cognitive framework around death that similarly cannot be verified. Even awareness is a contested term when applied to non-human animals. So the convention has become to describe behavior precisely and leave the interpretation as a separate and explicitly contested question. Mark Bekoff at the University of Colorado, one of the most prominent researchers working on animal emotional cognition, has argued that this caution is methodologically appropriate but cuts both ways. The same rigor that prevents claiming animals grieve exactly as humans do also prevents confidently dismissing the possibility that something functionally similar to grief is occurring in species that show these behaviors. Bekoff documented a group of magpies in Boulder, Colorado, in 2009, standing beside a dead magpie and placing grass blades next to the body and remaining there, still, for several minutes. He described the behavior as a vigil. He was careful about the word. He used it because nothing else fit what he had witnessed. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. The central division in the research, the one that separates animal cognition researchers most sharply from each other, is whether any of this behavior requires an actual concept of death or simply requires the ability to detect and respond to biological signals of extreme physiological distress. There is a meaningful distinction between responding to the chemical signature of dying and understanding death as an endpoint. A shark responds to blood in the water. That is a chemical signal triggering a behavioral response. No one proposes the shark has a concept of mortality. The question for elephants, chimpanzees, crows, and cats is whether what they show is closer, functionally, to the shark's response or to something that requires a more complex internal model of what is happening to a specific known individual. The piece of evidence that makes the simpler explanation difficult to maintain is behavioral specificity. Dogs do not behave the same way around every sick animal in a room. Elephants do not spend hours beside every unfamiliar set of bones they encounter. Chimpanzees did not groom every weakened individual in Pansy's group with the intensity they showed her in her final hours. What the animals appear to track is something specific about a particular individual in a particular state, not just a chemical signal floating loose in the environment. That specificity implies recognition. It implies that the dying individual is known to the responding animal as a specific entity, not merely as a biochemical event. Frans de Waal, the primatologist who spent decades at Emory University studying social cognition in primates, documented behavior among bonobo groups that illustrates this pattern directly. When an older female in a captive group began showing signs of serious decline, the other females in the group stopped competing with her for food in the way they had done previously. They began allowing her access to preferred spots they had contested for years. They did not extend the same accommodation to other animals in the group, who were simply lower ranking. They extended it to her, at that specific point, in response to a specific change in her condition. De Waal described this as accommodation, a recognition that something had changed in her situation within the group, not through the ordinary mechanisms of social hierarchy, but through something the other animals appeared to register as categorically different. Elephants return to where their dead have fallen. This is one of the most consistently documented facts in elephant field research, confirmed across the Amboseli records, and through independent field observations at multiple sites in East Africa and elsewhere. They use their trunks to touch the bones, particularly the skulls and tusks, of dead individuals they encounter. They will spend significant time with a skeleton, even if it is years old, even if no member of the current group was present at the original death. Joyce Poole, who worked alongside Cynthia Moss for decades and later founded the nonprofit Elephant Voices, observed a herd responding to the bones of a former matriarch 12 years after her death. The group's current matriarch spent more than an hour examining the skull, returning to it repeatedly after brief intervals. Younger animals who had never encountered this individual in life approached the bones and touched them. The behavior continued until the herd eventually moved on. Poole has been careful throughout her career not to overstate what the evidence allows. But she has stated clearly that the alternative explanation, that elephants are simply curious animals investigating any novel object they encounter, does not survive scrutiny when examined against the specificity of what she has observed. Elephants encounter objects far more novel than old bones on a regular basis. They do not respond to those objects this way. The most ambitious research in this field has tried to test whether animals show behavioral evidence of anticipating death before the physical signs become obvious to human observers. This is an extraordinarily difficult thing to design for. Controlled experiments are not possible for ethical reasons. What researchers have built instead is a large body of naturalistic observation, collected in the wild and in managed populations over many decades, and then examined that record for what it implies about when the animal's behavior changed relative to the progression of an individual's condition. The Amboseli data, representing more than 50 continuous years of observation and the longest-running elephant study ever conducted, contains dozens of documented sequences in which detectable changes in herd behavior preceded the obvious physical deterioration of a dying individual. In several of those sequences, the dying individual was still eating, still moving with the herd, still engaging in normal social behavior, at the point when the surrounding animals began behaving differently. The changes were not dramatic. More proximity, more tactile contact, a reduction in the tolerance for anything that might disturb the area near the individual in question. But the changes were there in the record, consistently, and they came before the clinical progression that any human observer would have identified as significant. Whether that constitutes knowing is a question Moss has addressed directly in interviews conducted across 3 decades of her work. She has said she believes elephants know, in some meaningful sense, when one of their own is close to the end. She has also said she cannot prove this in terms that would satisfy every skeptic in the field. She says both things in the same sentence because both things are accurate. The crow data from Swift's work contributes a dimension that the mammal data cannot easily provide. Birds have a neural architecture organized very differently from mammalian brains. The specific structures associated with emotion and social cognition in mammals do not have clear equivalents in avian nervous systems. Crows are cognitively sophisticated by any measure, with brains large relative to their body size and behavioral flexibility that rivals many primates in experimental settings. But they arrived at that sophistication through a different evolutionary pathway. And yet the behavioral response to dead members of their species in crows is, across Swift's dataset, more consistent across individuals than in any mammal studied to date. Every crow that encountered a dead crow responded in some version of the same way. Swift found that the response appeared even when the dead crow was from an entirely different geographic population, a bird the responding crows had never encountered and shared no social history with. The consistency at that level suggests the response is not learned from experience or acquired through social transmission within a group. It appears encoded at the species level, something that predates any individual crow's experience of death and persists independent of whether any particular crow has ever witnessed a death before. This is the part of the story that shifts the frame of the whole question. Evolution builds responses to things that matter for survival with a consistency that matches the strength of the selection pressure. Behaviors that cost energy to perform and take time that could be spent doing other things get trimmed from the genome over time if they do not pay their way. The fact that crows, elephants, chimpanzees, dogs, and magpies all show responses to dying companions that have been consistent enough to attract decades of systematic scientific attention points toward a straightforward conclusion. Death in a social group has been relevant to survival for long enough, and in enough different animal lineages, that responding to it has become worth the cost. Why would that be? Because the loss of a known individual changes what a social group can do. It changes who protects the young, who carries the memory of where water can be found in a dry year, who helps arbitrate the frictions between group members that would otherwise escalate. The social architecture of a group built around specific individuals becomes, when one of those individuals is lost, a different structure with different capabilities, and the group that can begin adjusting to that loss before it arrives is better positioned than the group that cannot. Anticipating the death of a companion is not a luxury in a life organized around tight social bonds. For animals that depend on specific individuals for their survival in specific and documented ways, the ability to detect early that a companion is approaching death and to begin, however gradually, reorganizing around that absence could carry real selective advantage. Evolution does not maintain costly behaviors without return. The return here is time. This reframes what EB was doing in that dry lakebed in Amboseli. She had lived in the same group as her brother for decades. She had navigated droughts with him, raised calves in his proximity, and helped determine where the herd would move and when. His absence was going to reshape everything about how the group functioned. The 3 days she spent beside him were also 3 days in which she was present at the place where the change was happening, in which the herd's behavior was already beginning to account for what was coming. When the researchers came to examine his body after he died, EB was still there. She stayed for another half day before finally moving the herd away. Before she left, she touched his face with her trunk. Moss recorded it without commentary. In interviews afterward, she has said, when pressed, that she does not know what EB understood in that moment. She only knows what EB did, and what EB did was stay. That gap is where the honest version of this question still lives. The behavioral evidence accumulated across these species, in these studies, across these decades of observation, is substantial enough to say that something real is occurring when animals respond to dying companions. The response is not random. It is specific to individuals, and in documented cases, it begins before any human observer can identify the cause. The cognitive interpretation of what that behavioral reality represents remains genuinely open. Whether a crow's response to a dead companion represents something felt, or only something chemically triggered and evolutionarily ancient, the question has not been resolved, and the researchers who have thought most carefully about it will tell you so directly. The animals were navigating this before anyone thought to ask the question. They have been finding their way through it for longer than our ability to describe what they are doing, and they will keep doing it in the field and in the archive and in the fossil record that nobody has yet figured out how to read, long after this particular question has found its answer. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.